Russ Gautier from Perception NYC. Perception, amazing studio in New York. I'll let him take it from here, show his reel and all that fun stuff. Let's give him a big welcome to the Maxon stage.
Thank you, thank you. Fantastic. So first of all, a huge shout out to Maxon for once again hosting an absolutely fantastic show. The lineup this year is completely ridiculous, and I'm totally humbled and honored to be amongst such a fantastic crew of people. So, my name is Russ Gautier. I'm the Associate Creative Director at Perception in New York City. And today we're going to be discussing futuristic cinematic techniques in Cinema 4D. But before we get started, I want to jump into just a little bit about who Perception is. So we were founded in 2001 by Jeremy Lasky and Danny Gonzalez, the two partners of the company. We are based in the heart of New York City in Midtown Manhattan. We are a team of multidisciplinary designers, UX artists, visual effects artists, everything. We have generalists all over the place, and we have one unique focus, and we call that science fiction thinking. This is our sort of laser-focused direction. What is science fiction thinking? To me, it's this idea of envisioning the future of technology and design through the lens of what's possible rather than what currently exists. And it sounds like, yeah, that's just sort of a little shift, but it really helps us kind of open the blinders in a lot of ways to envisioning things that are past the horizon rather than what is currently out there right now. So it really helps, it helps us kind of expand our ideas. So we do this through the mediums of UX, design, both 2D and 3D. We do animation and visual effects. So we do these things in two primary categories. We work on feature films and we work for large tech companies. So on the feature film side of things, we've most recently finished up work on Spider-Man Far From Home. We've worked on all of the Avengers movies, Black Panther, Thor Ragnarok. The list goes on and on and on. So on our website, you can see our feature film montage, and I have that queued up, so I'm going to let that play for you guys now. So there's just a taste of what we've done for the worlds of film, which is always very exciting. On the other side of things, because we really only spend about half our time working on feature films, the other side of things, we're working with big tech companies, right? So if you name a big tech company, we've probably worked with them. So things like we worked on early development for the Microsoft HoloLens before it was even the Microsoft HoloLens. We've worked on the Samsung Galaxy. We do a lot of work in the automotive sector, including some work on the Ford GT, and many, many more. As you can imagine, those are all highly NDA'd projects that I can never talk about. So what this really means, though, this sort of dual focus that we have this film work, and of course, you know, all of the big tech company executives, they go watch all these movies that we work on, and they ask us to bring some of that cinematic process and thinking and visualization to their tech projects, into the tech world. But then also on the tech side, we learn a ton through just research and development and just being mega geeks about this stuff, around like just what is possible, what is actually out there, what is like right on the cutting edge of now. And we bring those, that kind of aesthetic and those ideas and that thinking into the world of film as well. So they really just kind of inform each other in this kind of endless loop of kind of learning and growing. So that's a little bit about what we do. So today, what I want to discuss, of course, is futuristic cinematic techniques in Cinema 4D. So I'll be going through a handful of techniques, anything from super basic all the way up to fairly advanced. So hopefully there's something in here for everybody to come away with from this presentation. And specifically, I want to focus on some of the work we did for Spider-Man: Far From Home. Now we'll get back to that in just a second, but I do want to touch a little bit on why we use Cinema 4D, because Perception is a 100% Cinema 4D studio. We know it, we love it. It has been our tool of choice for forever. We love working with cinema because really it's a designer's 3D tool. And at the end of the day, most of the creative team at Perception started as designers. We are all graphic designers by trade. So for us to be able to get in and design things super quickly is fantastic. It's accessible and easy, so it's really, really good to pick up and just get things visualized really quickly, but it also goes super, super deep. So like digging into coding and Python, Espresso, and now Redshift, which is some of the things that we're going to discuss today. It's really a fantastic tool. So back to Spider-Man. I can't show any of the scene files today because the movie is still in theaters. If you haven't seen it, please go see it. It is a fantastic movie, and we had a ton of fun working on this one. But what I can do is show you guys the techniques that we used to generate some of the holograms. And so we're going to do holograms with Redshift today, because really Redshift completely changed the game for the way that we tackle holograms for feature films and for these tech projects, right? Huge, huge shift in the way that we do what we do. So Redshift advantages, before I dig into actually showing stuff, it's incredibly fast and flexible. If you've never used it, it's ridiculously fast. Highly scalable. We're a very small studio, and the fact that we can just stick a couple more video cards in a couple machines and like literally double our render output, it's crazy. It's a fascinating, fascinating product. It is production ready. We've used it many times on feature films. And it's incredibly well integrated into Cinema 4D. So like as you learn Cinema 4D, and you can actually learn and grow with Redshift as well, which is amazing. It's an unbelievable tool. So that said, I'm going to dig into my first scene file here. And what I have a very simple setup. If I jump into the Redshift render view here, I'm going to bring this up. This is something I'm going to bring up a few times throughout, so I'll probably minimize it and bring it back up and whatever. But it's really, like, if you're not familiar, the Redshift render view is kind of your window into what Redshift is going to render for you. It's an amazing tool. So I'm actually just going to turn off the car, and I'm going to turn off the table surface, and I'm just going to render what I currently have in here. Really, like, what I have is just this very simple image. It's actually the corner of our conference room at the studio. And what I'm going to do with this is put a hologram on that table. And we're going to discuss how we can approach putting a hologram on that table and how we can make it look like it's light emissive and all that fun stuff. But then we can also take that a step further, which we'll do a little bit today as well. So I have in Redshift, I'm just using a dome light, and that dome light isn't casting any light. All it's doing is it's giving me my background so that I can put my things in the scene. So I have a piece of geometry that represents my table surface, and I have a car model that I threw in here, and that's what we're going to be turning into a hologram today. So we're going to discuss how to do that really quickly here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a basic Redshift material, and I'm going to throw that right onto my car. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to bring back up that Redshift render view, and we're just going to look and see what that looks like here. Give that a quick render. So you can ignore the fact that the table doesn't look like it has a material because it doesn't have a material yet. We're going to get to that in a minute. But what we're getting is just this basic shader on this car model, which is totally fine. What we need to do is come up with a strategy for how to tackle doing holograms in Redshift. So personally, my strategy is usually to get everything into comp as quickly as I can and really kind of dial the look in comp. That's just sort of the way that I like to work. It offers a great deal of flexibility. But in order to do that, I need the passes that I'm going to be able to use in comp done correctly here in Cinema 4D first. So that's what we're gonna talk about setting up. So when we think about holograms, we think about these things generally as being like a light emissive surface, right? The problem with just making it light emissive, like if I throw an incandescent material on this car model and I give this a render, now I just have like a white silhouette of a car, right? Like I've got no detail whatsoever in there, and that's a problem, right? So the very first thing that I like to do when we're thinking about working with a hologram is go to a Fresnel shader. And so for those of you who maybe have heard of the Fresnel shader or maybe not, the Fresnel shader is a fascinating tool that really allows you to generate a look. Let's see if I can just throw in a sphere here, or maybe we'll just do let's do a torus. That's easy. We'll just shrink this guy down a little bit. And I'll demonstrate what the Fresnel shader is actually doing for us. So what the Fresnel shader does is it generates a gradient based on the angle of the faces that face towards the camera. And that's going to be a little easier to show than it is to tell. So if I just hit the play button here, I've got my Fresnel shader on my basic torus, right? So you can see that the geometry that's facing towards the camera is getting a darker color. The geometry that's facing away from the camera is getting a lighter color. And this is going to really let us get a great deal of detail in this kind of like light emissive look for a hologram. So let's go ahead and throw the car back in here. I'm going to turn that car back on. I'm going to I'll leave my table surface off for the moment. So let's go ahead and open this up. Let's look at what this car looks like with the Fresnel shader on it. It's just a basic Fresnel shader. That looks way better than it did before, where it was just like a big solid white silhouette. Now you can actually see detail on the car, which is fantastic. So that's kind of step one, which is cool. The other thing I want to do, I really like an AO shader. AO shader is ambient occlusion. And I like to throw an AO shader onto these things as well. I find that if you take an AO shader and you invert it, you can actually get a really nice kind of like additional light emissive look. So AO shader basically generates like ambient shadows. But if you take this channel and you flip it in post, you can actually get some cool, like very easy light emissive looks, right? Cool. So what I want to do now is think about back in this basic material that I've got. I want to think about some of the passes, some of the things that I'm going to need in After Effects or Nuke or wherever I'm going to comp this thing. What are the things that I'm going to need in order to make this thing look like a hologram? So I'm going to go up to my Redshift render settings, and I'm going to go to the AOV tab, and I'm just going to open my AOV manager. And this is, if you've not used Redshift before, this is where you're going to put all of your passes that are going to render out. So you can render out things like separate reflections and specular highlights and emission passes and that kind of thing. So I know, because I've got an area light in here, I definitely want to, I want to capture, let's see, I want to get reflections for sure. I want to get specular lighting. That'd be handy. I want to get probably emission, and let's see, I definitely want to do a puzzle mat as well. So a puzzle mat is just a, it's just a mat that renders an RGB channel into one image, so that you can have, basically you have 3 mats in one image rather than just having to render 1 mat for 1 image. So I'm going to use a material ID. I'm just going to set this to 1. And in order to link that up and make sure that that works here, I'm going to come down to my Redshift material. I'm going to go to the Output tab under Material. I'm going to set the material ID here to 1 as well, and that way Redshift knows, like, anything that this material is applied to, just make that red in the puzzle mat. So I'll show you what that looks like here in just a second. So let's go ahead and open this back up and fire this up. I'm going to do bucket rendering because the puzzle mat won't render in progressive mode, so I have to use buckets. But now that I have this thing rendered out, I actually have all, you can see I've got, under this tab, I've got all my passes. My emission pass is going to be empty at the moment because I don't have any emissive materials on. But I do have my puzzle mat, and you can see that's giving me a mat for my car, which is great. We're going to use that. The reflections pass is fairly limited at the moment, but that's going to get a little bit more robust here in just a second. And then specular lighting is capturing the lighting from that area light up top. Cool. Fantastic. So that's good. Let's talk about the other passes that I talked about here, right? Because we didn't really see, I've got this Fresnel pass and I've got this AO shader in here that they're not really hooked up to anything yet. I want to get them involved in this too. So Redshift has a really nice tool called Color to AOV. Here we go. So what this is going to do, it's basically going to parallel render all of these things all together, and I'll show you what that looks like here. So we're going to take the color output from my material. We're going to pipe that into the beauty input, which is basically just a pass-through. And we're going to take our Fresnel, we're going to take that, and that's going to go into AOV input 0. We're going to take our AO, and we're going to pipe that into AOV input 1. Awesome. So I'm going to take the output of this, the out color, and that's going to go into the surface node, into the output. I'm going to get that out of there. So what I need to do is establish some custom names for my 2 incoming AOV passes that I wanted, my Fresnel and my AO. So I'm going to do a add new custom AOV. I'm going to call this car Fresnel, and AOV input 1, I'm going to call this car AO. Cool. So we can see that if I go back up to my AOV manager and render settings, those actually have been automatically added into my AOVs, which is super nice. So let's go ahead and one more time open up the render view, see what we got here. All right, so I'm going to give this a quick render. So that looks totally the same. That looks exactly the same as what it did before. But now I also have my AO pass built in, and I have my Fresnel pass built in. So all of these are going to render at the same time. I don't need to set these up as like separate takes or separate render passes or anything like that. It's really, really fantastic. So rather than sitting here and actually, you know what? Let's do this. Let's do the table surface. Let's get a basic shader in there for that, because we haven't done that yet. We're going to do just another basic material, and for this particular task, I don't really care about the color of the material so much. I really just care about the reflections, because that's all I'm going to use for comping. I don't want to like color the table a different color. I want the table to look like the table. I just want the reflections coming off of my car. So before I do that, I'm actually going to name my materials. So we're going to call this RS car, and we're going to call this RS table. It's just good process to get into for just keeping things organized, so not everything is RS material 1, 2, 3, 4. And this one, I'm just going to keep this one super, super basic, because like I said, I don't really care about the color. All I care about is reflections. But I do know that my table does have a little bit of like a matte surface on it, so I'm going to come in here. I'm going to set this roughness up to like 0.3, just so we get a little bit of a matte surface on there. So let's go back to Redshift render view, and we'll go ahead and hit play. And we'll go to the beauty. So now you can see I've got a table surface. Out of this pass, I'm not going to use the beauty pass. We'll look at what we're going to use here in just a minute. So, let's turn on my bucket rendering so there I can see my puzzle mat. That's great. Okay. Reflections, that's fine. Specular lighting, so now you can see I've got this specular lighting. But really all I care about with specular lighting is on the car itself. I don't really want specular lighting on the table. We'll get to that in just a moment. And then car AO and car Fresnel. Now, one problem I have is I've got this table in here, but I'm not seeing the reflection of some of these passes on my table. I want the reflection of some of these passes on my table too, so that I can comp those up. So what I need to do is come back in here to my AOV manager, and I'm come to let's go to my puzzle mat and tell it to reflect and refract IDs. And then for car Fresnel, I'm going to do secondary ray visibility both. Probably don't need to do both, but I'm going to do both just to be safe. And same thing for AO. So I'm going to get all of those things, in theory, reflected in my table. So let's take a look at what that looks like really quick. Awesome. Okay, so there I'm starting to see a little bit in my car Fresnel, and spec lighting, we knew that. Car AO, now I can see I've got my AO pass actually reflected in the table, which is super cool. And then likewise, if I turn on my bucket rendering again and go up to puzzle mat, now I actually have my puzzle mat reflected in the table as well, which is kind of nice, right? All right, cool. So rather than sitting here and watching me render this thing and everything, I actually have an After Effects project set up where I've already rendered and done like a little bit of a rough comp on this stuff, just to show you guys kind of how we might approach this comp strategically in After Effects. I won't spend a lot of time in After Effects. I really want to focus my time in Cinema and Redshift, but I also want to show you kind of how we can go about using these passes, right? So I've got my background plate. Now I actually shot this very purposely in our kind of bright, sunny conference room because comping light-emitting holograms in a very light scene can be traditionally a very challenging task. So one of the things that I like to do, very first thing, is take my AOV, my puzzle mat. We've turned this white by just doing a shift channels, and I've got a little bit of a levels adjustment on there to do some correct. And then what I do is I'm using a colored solid. And what this is going to do is it's going to give my car a little bit of a dark background to like really kind of pop those light colors off of there, which is cool. So then I have my car hologram on top of that. And in that comp, really all that is it's my Fresnel shader. So I've got my two Fresnel shaders. I've got it separated for the ground as well as for the car itself. I've got my AO pass that, like I said, I had inverted. So this is actually the AO pass, but just flopped so that it looks like it's emitting light rather than casting shadows. The next thing I've got up here is my specular highlights, and then just some additional reflection passes on top of that, right? So nothing crazy, but we're using an add mode. We are doing a little bit of a color correct on this thing to get it into a nice kind of like cyan kind of blue, right? Cool. So this is fine. But another thing that we really like to do with this is to actually kind of see inside, right? So like one of the things I always think about holograms, like the real potential with the hologram is to like kind of treat it like an X-ray, like I can see a whole bunch of things going on inside this. So what I'm going to do is make a brand new, I'm just going to make an incandescent material. And we're going to call this RS Car Interior. And we're going to throw that onto my car model here. And with this one, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use that Fresnel again, but this time I'm going to use it a little bit differently. So I'm going to bring that Fresnel shader back in here. And instead of using it to drive the color of my model, I'm actually going to use it to drive the transparency or the alpha channel of my model. And you're going to see what that does here. As soon as I get this rendered, what we're going to be able to see, well, we don't want the puzzle mat, we want the beauty pass. There we go. So now I can actually have like a X-ray vision of my car because it's using that Fresnel pass. It's using the same principles of the Fresnel shader, but it's using it to drive the alpha instead of the color. My color is consistent. It's my alpha that actually changes. So that's pretty fun. If we look at, I've got a handful of these passes in here. You can see we're getting it in the reflections. Specular lighting doesn't really have much. And then, of course, AO and everything. We're not going to have much AO on something that has a whole bunch of transparency to it. So once again, I've actually rendered that out already, so we don't really have to worry about that. You don't have to sit here and watch the grass grow. And so this is what it ends up looking like. And really all I'm doing here is I'm taking my car interior. So I've got my basic Fresnel pass. I've got my AO pass like I had before. I've got my my specular lighting. But then I'm starting to bring in this internal Fresnel shader, which is really, really helpful. The other thing that I ended up doing there as well is actually turning on GI. So if I make another render setting, we're going to call this Fresnel Interior. And I'm going to change up my passes here for this one. I'm just going to get rid of all of these. We're going to throw in a GI and an emission. And for this one, we're going to turn on GI. So we're going to let this model cast GI onto the surface of the table because, you know, like I said in the beginning, the whole idea behind a hologram is it's light emissive, right? Like it's this sort of light emissive thing. So you want it to be able to cast light on the surfaces around it. So if I turn on my Redshift render view, let's go ahead and bring that up again. So here we go. And now if I look at my GI pass, you can see what that's doing. I mean, it's a little grainy because my render settings are really low, but what it's doing is it's literally casting light from that light emissive material onto the surface of my table, which is really cool. So I'm using that a bit as well, which you can see if I jump back to this main comp here, I actually have that AO pass. So what I've done here is I've done a little bit of color correct, a little levels adjustment, and just turned it blue. So it's, you know, because I have a blue card, it needs to cast some blue light, right? So I actually have a couple of these already rendered out. I did some animations. So this is, let's see, actually I lied. Hold on, we're going to come back to that in just a second because there's one important thing that we need to discuss, and that is wireframes, right? So like we've got this kind of emissive base car. We're seeing the sort of interior workings of it, which is really cool. But holograms, a lot of times, at least sort of traditionally, for the last several years, have had some kind of a wireframe on it. And that's one of the things that I really want to talk about is how we can get a really nice looking wireframe off of this car. Now, Redshift actually has a wireframe shader built into it, but I actually have a different technique that I really like for making wireframes, and that involves just going in here. We're going to do a select children on this null. So like you can see there's tons of parts and pieces in this thing. What I want to do is select children. So I've literally selected all of the objects under that null. And I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to say, what am I looking for? Connect objects. And what it's done, if I turn off this null object, what it's done is it's taken that entire hierarchy and it's flattened it down into a single object. The reason I want to do that, I'm actually going to get rid of this material. We're going to need that on there. The reason I want to do that is because I want to actually grab all of the edges, all of the splines that make this thing up, and I want to separate those out into a separate object. So I'm going to hit Control-A or Command-A on a Mac, and it's going to, in edge mode, it's going to select all of the edges of this entire model. And I'm going to go up to Mesh, Mesh Commands, Edge to Spline. And what that's done is it's actually generated a singular spline that is all of the edges of that car model. Now, it's a fairly dense model, so this is going to go a little slowly, but I'm going to show you how we can take this and we can turn that into a really nice wireframe that we have a lot of control over using Redshift. So up under tags, I'm going to go under Redshift tag, and I'm going to drop a Redshift object tag on this. And you can see I've got this curve tab, and that's where I'm going to do all of my work here. So we're going to turn this into, let's do cylinders, and I'm just going to reduce the size of this down to like 0.1 because I know that 1 is pretty excessive. I also need a material, so I'm going to throw on a Redshift incandescent material onto my splines. There we go. And let's go ahead and open up the Redshift render view. Now, I will warn you, this model that I have is fairly dense, so it does take a second for Redshift to load this all into GPU memory. But once it does, it's actually a really quick render. Like, the actual render times are very fast. It's just, it has a lot of detail that it's loading in there. But the great thing about this technique is it offers you a lot of flexibility. You can now color all of these things with redshift shaders. You can change the thickness. It gives you like a spline for like controlling how thick and how thin each of these little splines end up being. And it's just an immensely powerful tool. So you can see here what we get is a really nice, clean wireframe. Now my wireframe here is probably a little thick. Those could be a little bit thinner. But once again, I've already rendered this out. And you know what? Let's do this instead. Let's do this before we get into the render. I'm actually going to get rid of all of these little selection tags, because the other thing is with the density of that, I like to have a little bit of separation between my kind of X-ray view and my sort of top surface view, right? So what I want to do is also render a wireframe that's just the front faces of the car. Like if the car had no like transparent materials or anything, I just want to see the wireframe of the outside of the car, so I can have that as a separate pass when I get into comp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw on a redshift object tag onto this car that I did the connect objects on, and we're going to turn this into a matte. We're going to enable the matte, and we're going to reduce its alpha all the way to 0, and then we're going to go back to our redshift render view, and we are going to cook that one as well. So again, this is going to take just a second for all of those that dense mesh to load its way onto the video card, but it will here just a moment. And then we'll have a lovely kind of traditional wireframe, if you will, right? So we'll have, when we render this out, we would have a wireframe that represents our interior of the car, this sort of X-ray wireframe, and then we would also have a wireframe for just the exterior of the car, so we can kind of dial and balance those things in After Effects as much as we want. So there's a simple wireframe of the front of the car, like really clean, really simple. And again, because we're doing this with redshift materials, we have a great deal of flexibility of how this ends up actually looking. Okay, so once again, I do have a version of this. So I've got this version here has 2 of the wireframes in there. So it's the same thing that I've shown before, except this time we have a interior, we have our exterior wireframe, and we have our interior wireframe as well. If I can find that one, that's right here. So you can see I'm kind of dialing those things separately. My exterior wireframe gets a lot of visual weight, and my interior wireframe gets dialed back a little bit just because it can get very, very dense, right? And we want to have a nice kind of visualization of the inside of this car. Cool. So I actually do have some renders of these things. This is just a turntable of this car, like with some additional kind of comp sauce and some glow and stuff. So you can kind of see how that ends up looking when it's rendered out and actually has some animation and movement to it. You can really get a nice sense of the interior of that car and this kind of like glowy exterior that looks like it's emitting light and everything. So that's a fairly standard hologram, if that's such a thing. So one of the things that I'm always looking for, and we're always kind of searching for at Perception, again, is just how we're going to push these things forward, right? What are some other ways that we can take this from being like a hologram that, has like a wireframe of Fresnel, and we can kind of push that into sort of future looks? Like, what are some other things that we can do with this? So I'm actually going to turn off my spline, and we're going to look specifically at this car here. One of the things that Redshift offers to us that we weren't able to do as much before is rendering very, very complex geometry very quickly, especially like point and particle-based geometry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a matrix object, which is kind of part of the MoGraph tool set. It's sort of in that realm. I'm going to use this to generate thinking particles, and then we're going to render those thinking particles with a great deal of density very, very quickly, which is extremely exciting. So we're going to throw on this matrix object. I'm going to set this to object mode, and right now it's set to generate matrices only. I want to generate thinking particles, and I do want to take my car model and drop that right into the object. And by default, this is set up to distribute over the surface. So at the moment, it's distributing 20 particles over the surface of this car. I want to set this to vertex. So what it's going to do is it's going to put one of those particles on every single vertex in the model, which is super cool. Now, in the past, what you had to do is actually clone some objects onto this. You had physical geometry to render. You don't need to do that anymore with Redshift. It's absolutely fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to Simulate, Thinking Particles, and I'm going to drop in a particle geometry object. And what that is, that's the thing that's actually going to render. That's going to take those thinking particles and it's going to basically give Redshift a thing to look at to render. But I need to connect those things up. Right now, the matrix and the particle geometry, they're not talking to each other yet. So I need to make them talk to each other. And in order to do that, I'm going to go up to Simulate, Thinking Particle Settings. And in this particle geometry, I have a particle group field. I'm just going to grab this all, and I'm going to drop that right into there. And then same thing on the matrix object. I'm just going to grab the all, and I'm going to drop it into the TP group. Cool. Okay, so right now it's not going to render anything because, in fact, I can prove that to you if I open up Redshift. Redshift render view, bring this open. And all I'm going to see is the table. Oh, right, I've got my car turned on. Let's turn that off. I don't need to see that right now. So all I have is the table. I don't have any particles rendering yet. And that's because what I need to do is on this particle geometry, I want to drop on another Redshift object tag. And now you can see I've got this particles option on my Redshift object tag because it knows that it's on a particle object, and this is what it's supposed to be rendering. Right now it's set to disabled. I want to make that point instances, and I'm going to set this to like, I don't know, 0.05. We're going to make these really, really small points. I love like a lot of detail, a lot of really dense detail, just makes me happy. So we're going to go back to our Redshift render view, and we're going to give this a quick render. We're going to see what we get. Boom. All right, so let's give it a material because right now it doesn't have any material. That's not going to do any good. We're going to use the same Redshift incandescent material that I used for the wireframes, but there you can see I have a great deal of particles. I've got a lot of density in there, and it renders lightning fast, which is super, super cool. So it's a really interesting way of generating something that essentially does the job of the wireframe, which is to show me this like detailed kind of technical interior of the car without being a wireframe. It's something else, which is cool. So of course I do have that sort of pre-made, so you can see what that looks like when we comp that up. You get this like it feels just different from a wireframe, right? Like it just has a little bit more interesting look to it. And of course, I do have a animated render of that, which I'll show you. Cool. So there's my vertex particle car tumbling around in our conference room. Cool. But that's not all that we can do with this whole thinking particles thing, right? Like we can do a lot more than that. So let's look at some different ways that we can distribute these points on this car. Right now we're set to vertex, so it's putting each of these, it's putting a particle on every vertex. What I'm going to do is set this to surface. And you can see that what's left over, it's an artifact of thinking particles, which you need to do in order to kind of reset the thinking particles, just go forward a frame and then jump back to frame 0. It's just thinking particles. So what we need to do is we're going to crank up this number. Right now I've got 20. Let's try 10,000. Let's just throw 10,000 on there and see what that does for us. Let's see what we get. Cool. There's 10,000 points on the car. No problem. All right, let's try 100,000. Let's throw 100,000 points on that car. And we're going to hit the refresh button, so Redshift refreshes. Okay, so there's 100,000 points on that car. Cool. That's rendered ridiculously lightning fast because all of that geometry is being instanced at render time. Let's try 500,000 particles. Let's try 500,000. See what we get. There we go. So there's 500,000 particles cloned onto the surface of that car in 0.38 seconds, which is ridiculous. It's ridiculously fast. So this kind of gives us a cool, almost like a LiDAR scan kind of look to it, right? And I can take that, and again in comp, I've got a comped version of that, of course. So this is just a still comp with all of those points kind of wrapped onto the car. I think this one was actually 1,000,000 points, the one that I rendered here. But Redshift has no problem handling all of that geometry. Now, these could be spheres, or they could be triangles or squares or whatever you want. Like, these can be custom shapes as well. I'm just using spheres because they're so small you're never going to notice if it's anything else. So, of course, I do have a render of this as well. And this render I comped on a little bit of a sweep as well. So if I set that to repeat, you can kind of see how that works. So basically, it's sweeping across the surface of the car, and it's showing you this kind of like internal LiDAR scan of what's going on in the car in this very kind of like organic, noisy sort of way, which I think is pretty fun. Cool. So again, we can kind of take this a step further as well. I actually have a completely different scene set up where I've got this sort of Mixamo model. It's just this guy running, right? Like, that's all it is, just a guy running. But I can use the same exact technique over here because I've got a nice closed volume. If I throw in my matrix object, and let's set this to object mode, and we're going to make this guy the object. So I'm going to do that. Cool. And let's do, instead of surface, let's do volume this time. So we're going to put clones, we're going to put these thinking particles inside the volume. So again, I need to set this up to render, to generate thinking particles. I need to come up to my simulate and go to particle geometry, and I need to, of course, hook up all of these things together so that they talk nicely. I'm realizing I'm running a little low on time, so I'm going to go rather swiftly through this. Okay, so again, we're going to drop on our Redshift object tag, and we're going to set particle to point instance, and we're going to set that to, I don't know, 0.05 again is probably fine. Okay, so let's do this. Let's set this to something reasonable, like 25,000 particles on the inside of that guy. Now, one thing I do need to do is change the particle priority. You'll notice, like, if I hit play right now, well, maybe 25,000 a little excessive. Let's start with 2,500 just for the moment, and we'll come back to, we'll crank that number up here in a second. If I set that, that seems to actually be working okay. Might be making a liar out of me today. But really, you should be set this to after effectors, and that way, any effectors you have, because of course we're dealing with MoGraph objects at this point, so we can use effectors for all this stuff. Any effectors you want, you can throw them on here, and it works really, really well. But you want to make sure that you change particle priority to after effectors. That way, the effectors get processed first, and then the particles get generated. So you can see I've got my running guy here. I've got these particles being generated inside. Let's go ahead and crank up this number a little bit. Let's take it back up to 25,000. We'll open up our Redshift render view and give this a quick render, because there is one more thing I want to jam through pretty quickly for you guys. So here's the volume of this guy filled with 25,000 particles. Let's make that a little more interesting. Let's do 250,000 particles and see how that goes. So we'll just wait for that to think about what it's doing. I'm hoping that I didn't hit play and crash this thing. Let's see. Yep, that's going to take just a second because it's currently reading all the geometry. But basically the idea is we can take all of this really dense geometry, and we can actually render this very, very quickly. Once we have this going, it operates very fast. All right, so here we go. Now it's gonna unlock for me. Maybe. Let's see. It's generating all that geo inside that volume. So it's basically like scattering inside of a volume. So you can scatter on the surface, you can scatter inside the volume, and the render times are absolutely ridiculous. It seems like I might have made this a little mad, unfortunately. But there is something else that I want to talk to you guys about that's just completely different from all of this stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to ditch these for the moment, and we're going to start back with our regular mocap guy. We're going to jump forward, we're going to jump back. We're just going to get rid of all of the thinking particles here eventually. While that is thinking about what it's doing, it certainly seems to be moving a little slowly at the moment. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a completely different way of visualizing a hologram. Like, what's something completely different that we can do with this? What I'm going to do is throw in a MoGraph cloner, and I'm going to set this to grid array. And we're going to drop in, say, a MoText object. So let's get this in here. And I'm just going to put for the moment, I'm just going to put an X in there. We're going to set the depth down to something really small. We don't really need that to be too big. 0.1 is fine. 5 centimeters is fine. We'll just make it really small. What we're going to do is we're going to turn this hologram into some 3D ASCII art, which is really, really cool. This is something that we could not have done before R20. Like, in the advent of fields and everything, it really allows a great deal of really, really cool possibilities, especially when it comes to generating these kinds of holograms and things. So I'm going to take my cloner object. I'm just going to look from the side. Let's add a few more clones into this thing. Let's say we're going to do 10 in X. I'll keep this thing pretty light, so we'll do like 20 in Y and 40 in Z. There we go. And what I want to do is I want to put this grid array kind of around my character here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our running guy model as a field to actually affect those clones that we have going on in here. Whoa, all right. Cool. So what I want to do is change the instance mode to multi-instance and the viewport mode to points. And that way I can just work really, really swiftly. I don't have to worry about rendering all that geometry in the viewport. So I want to make sure that this ends up right around my character here. So I'm just going to set this up here. And I want to bring this in, let's make this like 80, so that it sits just nicely around my running guy model. And I do want to make this, say, twice as wide. Let's say 400 centimeters. Okay, so there I have my running guy model, all right? Cool. So what I want to do is I want to be able to affect these clones, and because I'm running a little bit short on time, I'm going to run through this really, really quickly. What we're going to do is we're going to use a plane effector. And the plane effector is going to allow us to pipe in fields into this thing. But by default, the plane effector actually is moving all of the positions of my particles. I don't want that. I'm going to turn that off. But I do want to turn on Modify Clone. I'm going to crank that up to 100%, because that's going to be really important for the fields to actually affect what clones we have going on in here. So I'm going to go under the Fall Off tab, and I'm going to drag my mocap guy right into the Fall Off tab here. And that's going to allow me to basically pass data from the points on the mocap guy onto the points in the cloner. You can kind of see what's going on there. If I change this color on my mocap guy to something that might be a little bit more visible, like a nice bright red, you can see that the points around my mocap guy are now being affected, and that's, that changes as he moves and animates. Those things change as well. So we're going to use that data to drive what clone shows up around my mocap guy, and we're going to make some interesting kind of ASCII art hologram out of that as well. So what I'm going to do here, let's go ahead and turn off the color, because I don't want it to affect color. I only want it to affect data, and that's what this little sine wave thing is here. So if I give this a quick render in the render view, we're probably just going to see a whole bunch of X's and no guy. All right, well, that's not really going to do. What I want to do is come up here to the cloner, and I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to make this one just a period. So I've got a period and I've got an X, and I'm going to set this from iterate. I'm going to set it to blend. So let's go ahead back into my Redshift render view. We'll go ahead and give this a render. There we go. So now I've got periods everywhere except right around my guy. So I've got all these X's right around my guy. So we're starting to get somewhere. We're starting to get something interesting. But I really like the idea of using the density of the character itself to kind of communicate this idea of fall off from our character. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm gonna not use a letter. I'm gonna say like the most dense one I'm gonna use is like a hashtag or a pound sign, and then from the bottom to the top, that's how the density is essentially going to fall off. What I'm going to do is kind of create an ASCII gradient, if you will. So This is going to be, let's use an @ sign for the next one. We're going to use, let's use like a question mark. So I'm just going to keep duplicating these and selecting characters that have less and less kind of visual density, like a /, and then the next one might be a asterisk, and I've got my period at the very end. So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like now. Oop, helps if I hit the play button. There we go. Cool. So now I've got a lot of different characters here, and it kind of falls off from the center outwards. My problem is that I've got a bit of a visualization issue because it's all white. It's all kind of stacked on top of itself, and I want to basically add a little bit of a fall off into the distance. So for that, I'm going to go back to my plane effector, go back to my fall off tab, and I'm going to use a linear field, right here. And the linear field, I am going to tell it to affect color. I don't want it to affect the data, so I'm going to turn that off. The linear field here, I'm going to basically set this to like a dark gray. And if I look from the side perspective here, I can actually see where my linear field sits in space. And that's basically creating a gradient from white to that dark gray here. And so I want to just kind of squeeze this in here. And now if I give this another render, we should see a bit more of a fall off into depth there. Yeah, so we're starting to get a little bit more visualization of some of these objects up front. Now, one of the things that I can do is, in my plane effector, if I go back to my mocap guy here, go to my layer, and maybe set this radius down to like 5. So it's not quite as dense. Now, this is a pretty like this mesh, this grid array that I have in here lacks a lot of density. So like you'd really want to get this dense. I just want to be able to move quickly here for you guys. So if I go back to my linear field, maybe what we do is change this color, make it a little bit darker. Come on, buddy. There we go. So we can go a little bit darker on this. We can really start to kind of see where that comes into play there. And then if I keep this open and keep it running, should be able to go like almost real-time, frame by frame, and actually see that guy running through that field. Now, of course, I do have a render of this already set up, and because I am pretty much out of time, I'll just show you guys what that ends up looking like after a little bit of post-processing and a glow and a little bit of a color change. So there's a completely different way of looking at the way that a hologram can be produced using Redshift and R20 in ways that it would be very, very difficult to do this prior to the existence of fields. And now we have a kind of 3D ASCII art hologram running through a volumetric field, if we will. So, that said, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to everybody online as well. Please feel free to see more at experienceperception.com and follow us on Twitter. Perception's Twitter is @exp_perception, and my Twitter is @robotastronaut_. So please give us a follow and keep in touch. Thank you very much.